Chapter 4. August. The heavy fighting around Soissons in July 1918 shocked Brailsford Junction out of its complacency. As the casualty lists grew and personal tragedy came to one home after another, we seemed much nearer to the trenches and the shell-shattered wheat fields of France, red with poppies and with blood. One of the first reactions of the saddened town was to forbid the war games we had been playing each Saturday on Earl's Hill. It seemed a shame, after all our work constructing dugouts and opposing trench systems, for we had thoroughly enjoyed our desperate battles. The only participant to protest loudly was Slammy Stillman, the overgrown town bully who had never played fair. He was the only boy who threw stones instead of the regulation clods of earth, and the only one who sometimes aimed at our Red Cross nurses who were identified by the dish towels each girl draped over her head. Their ceremony that really drove home the grim fact that war is not a game was the service held in memory of Raleigh Adams, one of the most admired boys in town. Neighbors of all faiths came to the Methodist Church to hear Reverend Houghton remind us that Raleigh had never hurt or hated anyone. The big service flag had been taken down and placed across the lap of Raleigh's mother. Her part of the ceremony was to remove a service star and to sew on the gold one. Everyone wept, and the war seemed terribly near. I found myself praying silently that Herschel's star would not have to be changed to gold. We wouldn't even have had Mother there to sew it on. There was a flurry of patriotism among the children of the town, the girls knitting khaki wristlets by the score and the boys competing to see who could collect the most peach pits, used in making charcoal for gas masks. Another lively contest was the scramble for tinfoil. Up and down the streets and alleys went the tinfoil hunters, each child for himself. But I had a helper. As soon as Rascal dimly perceived the general idea, he ranged ahead of me, searching the gutters for the shining foil. My ball of foil was one of the largest, thanks to an occasional contribution made by my raccoon. Rascal's only other assistance in the war effort was the help he gave me in my garden. While I hoed, he trundled along behind me like a little dog. He also helped me pick peas from a late planting. All the peas he picked, however, he kept for himself, opening each pod as though it were a small clam, and avidly shelling the green pearls into his mouth. He had little relish for the wax beans, which were coming on by the bushel, so, while I picked beans, he often took a comfortable siesta in the shade of the rhubarb leaves. It was pleasant out there in my garden. Warmed by the sun, cooled by an occasional breeze, the wax beans were smooth and golden, with the texture of satin, and they hung in such thick clusters beneath their leaves that it did not take long to fill a basket. Although the grocery stores paid me well for my vegetables, it was reward enough just to plant and harvest such a garden. My mother had told me that seeds carry in their memory the whole complex pattern of stem and leaf and flower and fruit, and she had shown me how the stamens and pistils began the seed-making process all over again. It seemed miraculous then, and no less miraculous now. I had been noticing that my little raccoon also carried patterns in his brain, as do the migrating birds and the honey-storing bees. I think I learned more about the orderly universe sitting in my garden picking beans than I ever did on a hard church pew listening to Reverend Houghton's sermons. One serious mistake I made, however, was to give Rascal his first taste of sweet corn. I twisted a plump ear from the stalk in one of my rows, stripped back the husk, and handed the corn to my pet, who had carefully watched the whole performance. Rascal went slightly berserk. No other food he had ever tasted compared to this juicy new delicacy which he was sampling for the first time. He ate most of the first ear, then in a frenzy scrambled up another cornstalk, pulling it slowly to the ground. He wrestled and struggled with a fresh ear, tearing away part of the husk and guzzling greedily as before. Still unsatisfied, he left the second ear half-eaten to climb a third cornstalk. He was drunk and disorderly on the nectar and ambrosia called sweet corn. I thought Rascal's binge was amusing, but when I told the story to my father, he looked at us both quite seriously and said, "I'm afraid you're in for trouble, Sterling." I certainly was in for trouble. Rascal spent less than half of the ensuing night in our bed, which didn't disturb me too greatly, since sleeping with a raccoon in August is a little too warm for comfort. I was aware that he must have let himself out and gone on a neighborhood prowl, but this was not unusual. On subsequent nights he took similar French leave, and he began sleeping soundly through much of the daylight hours. I didn't connect his nocturnal ramblings with his love for sweet corn, principally because he avoided our corn patch. The explanation was simple. To keep my woodchucks out of our garden, we had surrounded it with a woven wire fence and installed a gate with a strong latch. Rascal could have climbed that fence, but found it more convenient to raid the gardens of our neighbors. August is an intemperate month, in any case, when emotions go up with the thermometer, but the angry voices to be heard in our street each morning were sizzling even for August. One neighbor after another, easygoing, salty Mike Conway, handsome, slightly vain Walter Dabbit, and skinflint lumber dealer Cy Jenkins, and the terrible-tempered Reverend Thurman, found their respective sweet corn patches mauled by the same fiendish night raider. Plans for detection and revenge were underway. It was Cy Jenkins who found raccoon tracks in the dust between his corn rows and spread the news. My father was right. I was facing real trouble. A delegation arrived one evening to sit in a circle around my unfinished canoe, voicing their complaints while Rascal huddled in my lap for protection. "I seen that varmint's tracks right in my garden," Jenkins said triumphantly. "Like the 7 plagues of Egypt," Thurman sermonized. "Now, Sterling, we do like your raccoon," Mrs. Dabbit began. "But the next time he gets into my sweet corn," her husband warned. The threats came whizzing round like a buzz of angry hornets. "Next moonlight, I'll shoot him. I'll set a trap, so help me. Skunks, woodchucks, coons, what's next?" "Now, just a moment," my father said quietly. Among other civic responsibilities, he served as justice of the peace and knew from long experience how to handle a group of angry people. Mike Conway was willing to listen. "What do you suggest?" "If Sterling buys a collar and a leash for his raccoon—" "Not enough!" Cy Jenkins growled. "And builds him a cage," my father added. Rascal began to whimper, and I looked anxiously from face to face. Most were grim, but Mrs. Dabbit gave me a sympathetic glance before turning to glare at her husband. Reverend Thurman, belonging to a sect which will here remain nameless, glowered at my father and thundered, "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord." Thurman had been under his Model T all day, using pulpit words, but not in the Sunday manner. Something about his inappropriate quotation from the Holy Writ struck Mike Conway as funny. Mike had a lusty and infectious laugh, and when he threw back his head and roared, everyone except Thurman joined in the chorus. "Well, it's settled then," my father said. "Sterling, why don't you bring some glasses and a pitcher of cold grape juice?" Thurman and Jenkins didn't stay for the refreshments, but the rest of us enjoyed the cool drink, Rascal taking his from a saucer. "I'm sorry," Mrs. Dabbit said to me as she was leaving. "Rascal didn't know he was doing wrong." After neighbors were gone, I said bitterly to my father, "You can put criminals in jail, but you can't put my little raccoon in jail. How would you like to be led around on a leash?" "Now, Sterling," my father said soothingly, "it's better than having Rascal shot or trapped." "Well, all right, but I think Rascal and I will run away and live in a cabin in the woods somewhere." "In the woods?" "As far from people as we can get. Way up in the North Woods on the shore of Lake Superior, maybe." My father pondered this for a moment and then said, "How would you like to take a 2-week trip all the way up to Superior? Bring Rascal along, of course." "Do you really mean it?" "Of course I mean it. You can ask Conway boys to feed Wowzer and take care of your war garden." I snatched Rascal from the rug and started dancing crazily, which didn't disturb my raccoon. He was always ready for a romp. We had been given a reprieve, a wonderful 2-week reprieve. "When can we start, Daddy?" "Why, tomorrow, I suppose," my father said. "I'll just put up a sign on the office door." There were no superhighways in those days to streak impersonably toward some distant goal, scoring the countryside with ribbons of unfeeling concrete. In fact, there was scant paving of any kind, only friendly little roads that wandered everywhere, muddy in wet weather, dusty and dry, but clinging to ancient game and Indian trails, skirting orchards where one might reach out to pluck an early apple, winding through the valley of streams and rivers, coming so close to flower gardens and pastures of clover that one could smell all the good country smells, from new-mown hay to ripening corn. We started early the next morning, my father, Rascal, and I, in our usual places on the front seat. Turning northward toward Fort Atkinson, we passed our old farm and the Cumlin place as we ascended the Rock River Valley. Finding the source of streams was a passion for me. I had followed Saunders Creek all the way to its first spring nearly 10 miles north of Brailsford Junction, and I had always wanted to follow the Rock River to its source. So we went by way of the Horicon Marshes, as romantic to me as Sidney Laner's Marshes of Glynn. At some point in this neighborhood, we crossed the divide between waters pouring down the Rock River to the Mississippi and the waters pouring into Lake Winnebago and the Fox River to Lake Michigan, and thus down the lakes to the St. Lawrence and the Atlantic. When we saw the first creek running northeastward, I felt like the early French explorers of the region. We skirted Lake Winnebago for many miles, from Fond du Lac to Neenah to Menasha, where Winnebago empties into the Fox, there to cascade in several major rapids on its winding journey to Green Bay. We were making excellent time, considering the bumpy roads and 2 blowouts, which in those days one took with serenity, struggling with tire irons, inner tubes likely to be pinched, and hand tubes to inflate the tires. We had packed some of my casual sandwiches, hard-boiled eggs, fresh peaches, and a dozen donuts. There was no reason to bring any special food for Rascal. He ate almost anything, just as though he were a person, which he definitely believed he was. We bought a tin pail of fresh, cold milk at a farmhouse and feasted beside a bridge over a rushing stream. When Rascal had eaten, he curled up on the cushion of the big back seat, a coil of shining fur against the maroon leather, and there he slept happily all the afternoon. It is even more exciting to move from one arboreal region to another than to move from watershed to watershed. This second divide we were crossing was from the deciduous trees of southern Wisconsin, the elms, maples, oaks, and hickories, into the evergreen region of pines, spruce, hemlocks, and cedars. Now the farm odor and fragrances blended into the great perfume of the north woods, the sharp, spicy aroma of the firs, and the fine, hot scent of the pine needles lying 4 inches thick to blanket the forest floor. We began to see the first granite and basalt rock formations of the oldest geologic period of the world, the Canadian Shield, which carries in its treasure house some of the richest ores of the continent, iron, copper, silver, and many other minerals. My father knew enough geology and mineralogy to show me where the salts of copper had stained a cliff blue with azurite and green with malachite. These colors blended with assurance into the moss and lichen on the rocks, adding their tints to those of sky and water. I felt a twinge of conscience to be so carried away with this new and different beauty of northern Wisconsin. It was as though I was being unfaithful to southern Wisconsin and to my own Lake Kushkonig. In those days there were no motels and few other places to sleep along the highway, unless in a tent or under the open sky. I wanted to be a voyager on this excursion, sleeping without cover. My father was willing to gamble against rain, being as little concerned as I. We stopped on a point which extended into a small clear lake, unpacked such duffel as we needed, and arranged our camp. Safely out on an extremity of bare granite, its crystals possibly very old, we built a modest fire to cook our evening meal. I went to the bottom of the cliff with rod and reel to cast a wet fly toward an inviting expanse of ivory-white water lilies. On my 5th cast, an eager black bass, 2 1/2 pounds perhaps, seized the lure and tangled himself in lilies. I brought him out at last, eyes lustrous, scales shining. Cleaned, filleted, and fried golden brown, he made an appetizing fish course for 3 hungry campers there among the pines. We had no tent, only navy hammocks. Still trusting this bright, clear August weather, fringed everywhere with goldenrods and asters, we consigned ourselves to the canopy of the sky. That first night we tied one end of each hammock to spruce trees and the other to the rear bumper of the Oldsmobile. We had our easily imaginable difficulties climbing aboard these tipsy platforms of canvas while pulling the blankets around us. My father said he would show me how it was done. Firmly grasping the dowel pin which spread the upper end of the canvas, he eased himself onto his treacherous bed, but before he could cover himself with a blanket, the hammock flipped upside down. He landed unhurt but exasperated on a thick padding of spruce and pine needles. I laughed until I was breathless, and Rascal hurried over to see why my father was lying on the ground, muttering to himself. "I'll bet it's easy," I said confidently. I made a running dive, lit squarely in the hammock, held it for a minute, and then did a somersault. Now my father was laughing as hard as I was, and Rascal was scampering around as though he understood the joke. Just then, as the most appropriate moment, something else began to laugh. Maniacal, spine-chilling laughter from far across the lake. Holy Moses, what's that?" "That's a loon," my father said, "and he's laughing at us. He thinks we're crazy trying to sleep in navy hammocks." I was suddenly completely happy, in love with the loony world and with my father and Rascal. I didn't care where I slept or how many times I tipped out of my hammock. The new moon came up, a sliver of silver through the pointed firs on the far edge of the lake, and the fragrance of balsam and pine swept over the darkening point. We learned at last how to sleep in a hammock and still cover ourselves with our blankets. We soon dropped into blissful slumber with Rascal beside me. Little screech owls sang our lullaby, and at the base of the cliff there was a gentle swish-swish of small waves, the most soothing sounds in the world. It was shortly after midnight that the brakes began to slip. The first warning came when we bumped the ground gently in our collapsing hammocks. The car was backing slowly towards us. My father, thinking fast, threw a stone under the rear wheel. Rascal awoke more swiftly than I did and went prowling around the car as though he thought we were being attacked. My father and I were so sleepy that we merely removed the more obvious sticks and stones, rearranged the pine needles under our hammocks, and went back to sleep again. This was the way we would fix our beds from this night on, flat on the ground, the only way you can possibly sleep in a hammock. After a few growls and whimpers and trills, Rascal came back to crawl in with me under my warm blankets. The cool night went on without us, oblivious of this small intrusion of humanity, and the gentle serenade continued, a night heron's distant croak, the footfall of a fox, fish splashing in the pale moonlight. The sidereal universe went wheeling around us, pivoted on the North Star, which, as a very small child, I thought was named for us, when Mother had first shown me the Great Dipper and the star towards which it points. We awoke at dawn, wonderfully refreshed by a night in the pine-scented air. My father said he felt a little stiff, but I challenged him to join us for a swim in the icy lake. We dipped, towel-dried, and raced up the path to the cliff, panting and laughing, with Rascal dripping gaily along behind. For breakfast we had bacon sandwiches and the remaining peaches with black coffee from our granite-ware pot. As we sat munching our sandwiches, utterly contented, a very large bird came soaring over the lake. I spotted him first. "Look, a bald eagle!" My father watched the bird for several moments before he said, "No, son, but you were close. It's an osprey." "How can you tell?" "An eagle soars on straight pinions. The osprey has a slight bend in the wings. Our bird is only crested with white. The mature bald eagle has a head which is entirely white." Obviously, there was much I could still learn from my father, who explained complicated matters so simply. Rascal was begging for the last of my sandwich, standing on his capable hind legs, patting my cheek and reaching for the food. So I lay on the ground at his level, and we looked each other squarely in the eye as we nibbled at each end of the bacon sandwich, growling softly just for the joy of pretending we were fighting a little over the food we were sharing. Soon we were packed and off into the morning, through pine shadows and patches of sunlight which dappled the winding road through the forest. One of the several poems which I knew by heart at this age was Keats, on first looking into Chapman's Homer. "Then I felt I like some watcher of the skies, when a new planet swims into his ken. Or like stout Cortez with eagle eyes, he'd stared at the Pacific with all his men, looked at each other with wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien." My sister Jessica, the poet of our family, had told me that it was probably Balboa, and certainly not Cortez, who had brought this particular glimpse of the Pacific. Her criticism did not lessen my admiration for the sonnet, however. I was still in that uncritical stage which allows for the enjoyment of poetry. We came upon Lake Superior with similar astonishment and wild surmise, an entire ocean stretching far beyond the horizon, as though a sapphire half as big as the visible sky had been set among granite cliffs and northern pines. This sea of sweet water, as Radisson has called it when he had visited these shores in the autumn of 1659, is the largest and deepest of the Great Lakes. No cleaner, colder, or more crystal water will be found upon our continent. It is rightly named Superior, having no equal in the world. From our eminence above Chequamegon Bay, we could see several of the Apostle Islands blending into the far distance. As we hurried toward the lake, I found myself reluctantly admitting that this tremendous bowl of blue water was indeed more beautiful than my Kushkonig. On a lake of sparkling sand and clean-washed gravel, with the gulls crying overhead, my father and Rascal and I walked the beach, like a beachcombers in a dream. This might have been Crusoe's island. We were so alone with sea and sky. In a little pool made of an entering rivulet, my raccoon caught a glimpse of a gleaming minnow, and he caught it, which proved to be a trout, dappled with color. Rascal next explored the whitened stumps washed up by the waves. Through these labyrinths he felt his way, curious but cautious, apparently expecting to meet the rightful owner at any moment. The beaches of Lake Superior are strewn with agates. These beautiful jewels are the result of age-long water seepage into small cavities in the rocks. The water carries silica in solution strained by various minerals. The result is often a gem, which in cross-section shows rings within rings of crocus yellow through all shades of brown to deep, rich red. On the outside, agates are often pitted with no visible evidence of their interior beauty, which rivals the most subtle stained glass. If by accident broken open, however, they shine, wet and radiant, upon the beach. During that morning we found more than 20 stones worth cutting and polishing. Rascal knew nothing about agates, picking up and dropping almost any bright stone that took his eye. But he did find one of the broken agates, and I kept it for him to add to his pennies and his arrowhead. In time he grew impatient with this beach, which seemed to have no crayfish, and went to sleep in the hollow of an old stump until we also tired of the agate hunt. We ate at a small restaurant in Ashland, then followed the road westward, which brought us to the valley of the Brule River, the finest trout stream in Wisconsin. Needing supplies, we stopped in an old, unpainted crossroads store. There was everything imaginable for sale in that store: snowshoes, shotgun, deer rifles, and even a yoke for oxen. You could buy groceries as well as brightly colored yard goods, snow packs, and bear traps. There was also merchandise more fascinating to me, such as an excellent split bamboo fly rod and hand-tied trout flies, which I viewed with longing. While my father brought bread, bacon, and other necessities, Rascal and I browsed. I had been taught never to touch things when I shopped, but Rascal had no such scruples. He delicately fingered everything shiny at his level, never cutting himself or tipping over the object. His little hands examined the gleaming axes, peavy hooks, and entrancing fly reels. On went his happy investigation of log chains, garden tools, and other hardware. Only when he climbed on a counter and started touching the kerosene lamps did I stop him, for fear he might send one crashing to the floor. "Real smart coon you got there," the storekeeper said. "Make a good coonskin cap someday." "He'll never be a coonskin cap," I said fiercely and surprised at the anger in my voice. "Nobody will ever skin Rascal." We came at last to what would be our permanent camp in the North Woods. It was on a promontory some 20 feet above one of the deepest and most beautiful trout pools I've ever seen. Carved from the rock at a curve in the Brule, the grove shading the little hill was the only piece of virgin timber we found in all that north country. If the trees had been white pine, they would have been cut 40 years previously, but they were yellow pine, just as proud in the forest but almost useless to the carpenter, who calls the intractable wood devil pine, because it cracks and splinters in every direction and refuses to take a nail without a tantrum. The nearest branches were 35 feet above us, and the forest floor beneath had no vegetation, only a thick carpet of pine needles. The breeze was always gently stirring in this high canopied room, and again we had a projecting rock above the river for safe campfires. When the sun sank slowly westward through our pine-roofed mansion, we ate and prepared our beds upon the ground. I had almost decided that I would live here forever, thus avoiding permanently the nightmare of caging my pet raccoon. It was characteristic of my parent that he had not told me the real reason for this trip. He had been asked to testify as an expert witness in a case being tried before a judge in Superior, Wisconsin. Our camp was on the Brule, some 20 miles from the courtroom, so each day the court was in session, my father would leave shortly after breakfast, taking his packet of notes and documents, and would return during the afternoon. I had no interest in legal affairs, and my father was tranquil concerning my safety. He knew that I could scarcely get lost if I stayed on the river or one of its branches, and that Rascal and I could swim if we fell into one of the deeper pools. Several recent showers lessened the danger of forest fires, and we had seen no sign of bears, neither footprints along the stream nor trees scratched or rubbed at bear's length above the ground. Despite the war in Europe, the world as a whole seemed safe in those days. We had left our house unlocked in Brailsford Junction. We seldom took the key from the car. We trusted our fellow human beings, and particularly the creatures of the woods. 2 weeks of absolute freedom. Each hour was savored. The very first day, Rascal and I found an opening in the forest where the sunny hillside was festooned with blueberries, nearly as large and dark as grapes, their leaves lacquered deep red. We hurried back to the camp for a bucket and returned to pick 3 or 4 quarts of such delicious fruit that I ate a third as many as I put in the pail. Rascal had an even better record. He ate every blueberry he picked. That afternoon we were too busy exploring to find time to fish. Wearing only my swimming trunks, I padded over pine needles, as alluring to my bare feet as to Rascal's. We crossed small tributaries to the river and waded up the winding shallows, hoping to find the hidden springs from which they emerged. We walked the length of mossy logs, crossed and recrossed the Brule and its foaming riffles, ice-cold and amber-clear. Once I slipped on a submerged boulder and went laughing down into a pool below, with Rascal plunging in dutifully to follow me in my fun. Little red pine squirrels scolded us as though we had interrupted a service in a cathedral. Striped chipmunks came darting out, whistling and chirping, frantic with curiosity and eager to see the show. We had wandered far up the stream, and now the sun told us we should be getting back to camp. A pleasant breeze was tempering the August heat as we retraced our path, sometimes in and sometimes out of the water. Rascal fished the river's edge, feasting on minnows. I was seeing enough big trout where the sun struck deep into the pools to know that here was a stream to rival Isaac Walton's river dove. While we arrived at camp, we were astonished to find a robber in the process of gnawing his way into the wooden boxes which contained our salt, flour, and other dry groceries. I had never before seen a porcupine, although my father had told me about them, and this could be none other than the very animal, clumsy, pug-nosed, and bristling with quills. Porcupines can't throw their quills. These barbed harpoons, however, leave the original owner at a touch, but stay in the flesh of his enemies like fish hooks. Rascal had raced ahead for a closer look, but suddenly grew cautious. All of his ancestors seemed to be whispering in his ear, "Careful, it's a porcupine." I didn't want to kill the intruder. Using a long stick, I nudged him gently toward a small tree, up which he scrambled until he looked like a hawk's nest in the highest crotch. Then I went to examine the damage to our stores. It was our salt that he craved. He had ripped the salt box wide open and eaten enough to make him thirsty for the next 6 months. He wouldn't stay up that tree very long, I concluded, for he would have to come down to go to the river for a drink. Rascal and I lay on our backs, drinking cold pop from a case we kept in a nearby spring. "I'll bet he wishes he had a bottle of pop," I said to Rascal as we gazed up at the thirsty porcupine. But Rascal was too busy to pay attention. Holding his little bottle with both hands and feet, he drank as fast as a little raccoon can. He had no intimation that this free life would go on forever, or that soon he would be headed homeward to captivity.